Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. If any of you came here expecting to be given a learned lecture on theology, then you'll be disappointed, because I'm not an expert on theology, although my grandfather was a man of the church, to which my father responded by becoming an atheist, so I never had any religion at all. But tolerance is in the title, and that is what I want to talk about. Why is it under siege? Well, this would seem odd, because tolerance, we normally think of tolerance as a good thing. But one of the things that's come out of the rather fraught current debates on Islam, the challenge of Islam to European and Western societies in general, one of the things that's come out of it is that tolerance has receiving a bad name. Tolerating intolerance is something that liberals are often accused of. And indeed, in 2008, when the Dutch Queen, Beatrix, gave a well-meaning Christmas speech promoting tolerance and saying that society, the modern liberal democracy, Dutch society in this case, couldn't survive without tolerance. She was widely denounced in some quarters, specifically by a populist politician, the Dutch equivalent of the Tea Party movement, Geert Wilders, who is now who did very well in the last election, like Tea Party candidates, the versions thereof all over the Western world. And he denounced the Queen's Christmas speech and her promotion of tolerance as multiculti rubbish. So tolerance, in the eyes of some, is clearly not a good thing anymore. Now, when I say liberalism is under pressure or under siege, I have to define first what I mean by liberalism, because it's, of course, a highly misleading term, because it means different things in different places. There is the sort of classic European meaning of laissez-faire economics. And that means, in that sense, when continental Europeans say liberalism, what they really mean is conservatism. Newt Gingrich would be a liberal in that sense. The modern American sense, which as far as I know doesn't go back much further than the New Deal, but somebody could perhaps enlighten me on this. But the modern American sense, of course, is quite the opposite. It means left of center. What I mean is really another classic interpretation of liberalism, which might also be described as humanism, which is precisely tolerance. It's an attitude, perhaps more than a philosophy or an ideology. It means tolerance, individual freedom, individual autonomy, and moderation. And it's precisely this attitude that is now being criticized, denounced, attacked, and so on. And the attacks, I think, are coming and have always come, both from the right and the left. And since the left is rather a spent force at the moment in almost everywhere, it's coming mostly from the right, particularly in the context of the debate on Islam, the supposed threats to turn Europe into Eurabia, to Islamize the West, and so on. And this is where liberals are seen as the enemy. They're seen as the elite, the liberal elite, the cultural elite, and so on, which is not standing up for Western values, for Western civilization. It's not standing up to the challenge of Islam. Now, the criticism from both the left and the right, when it comes to liberals, classic liberals, is in fact quite similar. And this came up from the right, from right-wing nationalists, between the two world wars in the last century. It comes up often in far left-wing communist rhetoric, and it's coming up again now from cultural conservatives and people who set themselves up as defenders of Western civilization against Islam. And I'll try and sum up the things that are said about liberals or liberalism by its enemies. One, of course, is that it's wishy-washy. Liberals don't really believe in anything. They always see both sides of every question without really coming to any conclusion. Tolerance is really another word for indifference. Again, liberals don't believe in anything, so they can be tolerant towards others because they don't really believe in anything sufficiently to stand up for anything. It's boring because it's unheroic. Moderation is never very exciting. It's bourgeois, and bourgeois, of course, are, in the eyes of their enemies, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, bourgeois are not only boring, but they care only about their own creature comforts. They don't know how to sacrifice. They don't have higher ideals for which to sacrifice. All they care about is their home and their mortgages and their comfortable chair and their children and their little dog. That's sort of the view of romantics, both from the right and the left, of liberals. Heidegger, at least I can mention one philosopher in the lecture tonight, Heidegger coined the phrase comfortismus, comfortism, for this despicable bourgeois attitude. In other words, people who only care about their own comfort, and this he, without, of course, approval, called comfortismus. It goes against the romantic notion of politics that there has to be a higher ideal for which sacrifice has to be demanded, that one doesn't just think of material interests or economic interests or promote a form of moderation. No, there has to be something greater, something higher, something for which people can be heroic. And between the two world wars, in the 1910s in particular, when Germany was going to war with Britain, France, and other countries in Western Europe, this was turned into a true anti-liberal ideology. Germans were a heroic people in the minds of right-wing romantic nationalists. The British, the French, let alone the Americans, were bourgeois, only cared about material interests, did not have a higher ideal, and did not have a higher ideal about their own nation as well. As the Kaiser, I think, once put it in his charming manner, in France and Britain, nationality can be bought for a shilling by any Basuto nigger. Literally, these were his words, meaning that the sense of nationhood, a romantic sense of nationhood based on blood and soil, is somehow a higher form of national belonging than a nationhood based on being on a political concept of citizenship. So, quite literally, and it's the title of a largely forgotten book written in the 1930s, I think, by a Hungarian conservative, but liberal conservative philosopher called Aurel Kornai. And the book is about the roots of German ultranationalism, which started in the early 19th century, or it started probably earlier than that, but he goes back to the early 19th century, and he tries to describe the roots of Nazism, really. And the book is called War Against the West, because it was seen that way by a lot of German nationalists, that they were at war with a materialist, decadent West. And the terminology not so different, by the way, from what some of the Islamist revolutionaries are saying about the West today. The fact that it was the Twin Towers in New York that were destroyed was not for nothing. It was, of course, precisely that kind of symbol of materialism, business, finance, greed, and so on and so forth. You could even go back as far as the story to biblical times. This was, in many ways, what pious Hebrews thought about Babylon and the Tower of Babylon. And the Tower of Babylon is, in a way, a biblical version of the Twin Towers, where people speak many languages, where people challenge the power of God with their hubris, and so on and so forth. One of the key texts of this early 20th century romantic and anti-liberal nationalism was by a distinguished, although very conservative, German sociologist called Werner Sombart. I don't know if many of you have read his work, but his most famous book was called Merchants and Heroes, Händler und Helden. And the merchants were, of course, the liberals, the British, the French, the businessmen, the Jews, and so on, who were completely addicted to their comfortismus, as it were. The heroes were those who were prepared to sacrifice for a higher German ideal. And in many ways, it's still a text worth reading, especially in the context of current debates, not least, of course, in the United States, because there are still echoes of all these views held by people who, of course, never heard of Werner Sombart, but talk somewhat in that vein in their attacks on liberalism, and I include their liberalism in the American sense as well. The idea that tolerance is indifferent, means the same as indifference, is also an old anti-liberal idea. And I'm now realizing I am mentioning more philosophers than I thought I was going to. But one of the more interesting, very conservative European philosophers was Joseph de Maistre, who was a ferocious opponent of the Enlightenment. He himself lived in that time, was a child of the Enlightenment no less than Diderot or Voltaire or the other promoters of the Enlightenment ideals. But de Maistre saw the Enlightenment as an enormous threat to what he saw as the perfect order in society. And order for him was the most important thing. And the Enlightenment was dangerous, not because de Maistre himself was a particularly pious Catholic. I don't think he even cared much. He probably, like everybody else, believed in God, but he was certainly not a devout believer. But he believed in the authority of the church, and he believed that the great danger of the Enlightenment is that when man starts to rely on his own reasoning power, and no longer on the revealed truth of God, as relayed to us by priests, then you get chaos and disorder, and as it were, screwing in the streets, because often, of course, sexuality comes into these paranoid visions of anarchy in society. And de Maistre, in other words, thought that the order of the church, of the absolute authority of the church and the absolute authority of the monarchy was, and he also included, he said, the most important citizen in the orderly society is the hangman. In other words, a form of authoritarian terror to force people to believe and conform to a dogma was the only thing between us and chaos and a vision of hell. And he was the one who said, when he denounced liberals, who said, with liberals, tolerance is only a mask for indifference. In other words, liberals don't believe in anything, and that's why they're so dangerous. So we can go back a long way. And as I said, there are many echoes on this, even on the right, on the left. But the right and the left often touch each other in their shared hatred of liberalism in general, but particularly the liberalism as I've defined it. And I'm thinking, just to quote an example, I don't know if any of you have seen a very interesting documentary about a well-known Parisian lawyer called Jacques Vergès, who, among others, defended Carlos, the terrorist. He defended Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon during the war. He was on the defense team of Saddam Hussein and so on. And he sees himself as a leftist, very much as a leftist, and was sympathetic to Pol Pot in Cambodia. He himself is half Vietnamese, and born in La Réunion, so he's very anti-colonialist, a great follower of Frantz Fanon, and so on, but also a lover of very fine cigars and custom-made suits and the good life and fine wines. And he's in many ways a fascinating character. In any case, Vergès, in a book-length interview, said that social democracy, in other words, liberalism, but more in the American sense now than in the sort of laissez-faire economic sense, that social democracy was disgusting and debased because it has no grandeur. It doesn't have a sense of grandness. Whereas Stalin and Hitler and Mao had grandeur. They had a grand vision. And the fact that they killed millions doesn't matter. In fact, it sort of adds to their grandeur. It's these wishy-washy, liberal, comfort-addicted systems that have no sense of grandeur at all, that are mediocre. That's another word that you often hear about liberal society and liberals. It's mediocre. There's not only no heroism, there's no genius. Vergès, interestingly enough, when he talked about the debased nature of social democracy and the lack of grandeur, was actually quoting one of the assassins of Walter Rathenau, who was among other things, the economics minister, I think he was the economics minister, but somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, of the Weimar Republic. By no means a leftist, Jewish, but a liberal in the classic sense. He was assassinated in the 1930s. It was one of the last acts of terror before the Nazi takeover. One of his assassins, a hot-headed naval officer of the far right, was the model for Vergès in his denunciation of social democracy. So the far right and the left, really, and the far left, are very much on the same wavelength when it comes to their hostility of liberalism. I would quote another instance of this, although a slightly more milder form of it, but this time from the left. In 1935, when fascism was becoming stronger in Europe, it was still before the Spanish Civil War, but Stalin was about to start his big purges. Hitler had come to power in 1933. Concerned intellectuals and writers in Paris decided to organize a writers' conference to defend culture, as they put it. Now, the writers' conference, the people who organized it, some from the Soviet Union, many from France, but they came from all over Europe, included communists like Louis Aragon and Ilya Ehrenberg. There were leftists and so on. And it was very much an anti-fascist manifestation from the left, although not just from the Stalinist left. But one of the people there was the British novelist E.M. Forster, who very quickly felt out of place. And as he put it, about when he remembered the occasion, he said he got very tired of sitting through many eulogies of Soviet culture and to hear the name of Karl Marx detonate again and again like a well-placed charge and draw after it the falling masonry of applause. That's the kind of occasion it was. And his speech, as one can imagine, wearing his sort of Donnish tweed suit and talking in his sort of Donnish Oxford way about the importance of individual freedom and the freedom of expression and moderation and tolerance. In fact, it was an impeccable liberal speech. Did not go down very well. I mean, people didn't whistle and boo, but they basically treated him like an old fuddy-duddy who didn't understand the struggles of his time. He was out of touch. This kind of bourgeois liberalism had no role to play anymore in the real struggle against fascism. In other words, he was criticized for very similar reasons that liberals today get criticized by the defenders of Western civilization against the challenge of Islam, of being not standing up strongly enough, not being ideological enough, not being heroic enough, and so on. In this case, so again, just to underline my point about the left and the right taking a similar view. Now, how does one answer these attacks? How does one answer the allegation that liberalism is boring, ordinary, bourgeois, unheroic, and so on? Well, first of all, by saying that it's to some extent true. But the celebration of ordinariness, of bourgeois life, and so on, does not actually have to be boring. To be sure, romantic art of the heroic tradition of rafts tossed on stormy seas with or charging horses in battle scenes and so on are exciting, often, of course, but also often thoroughly mediocre art. Whereas Vermeer could conjure up a whole world, in a deeply moving world, simply by painting a milk jar in a bourgeois kitchen in Delft in the 17th century. In fact, Dutch art of the 17th century, and Vermeer was just a primus inter pares, he was one of many, but consciously celebrated the ordinary, the everyday, the moderate, if you like, the boring. But the boring could be turned into something quite unboring, which is the whole point of Vermeer's art. I mean, it could be turned into something even metaphysical, if you like. He, of course, also came and operated in a highly commercial society. 17th century Holland, the golden age, so-called, of the Netherlands, was not an aristocratic society. Aristocrats did not play much of a role. They were there, but they did not put their stamp on society. It was a society of wealthy bourgeois merchants. They were the ones who bought the art, celebrating the everyday, the ordinary, the moderate. And the unheroic, it was consciously unheroic. The everyday lifted onto a higher plane. It's interesting that this type of art is precisely what dissidents in Eastern Europe, certain famous dissidents in Eastern Europe, loved more than anything else.